Welcome. October being LGBTQ plus Awareness Month, we bring you this webinar on family building through ART, optimal medical, legal, and psychological support. I am Sarah Amaya, Curriculum Design Strategist and Webinar Coordinator at ASRM. Before we begin, please note, this webinar was developed by the Society for Assisted Reproductive Technology and the American Society for Reproductive Medicine as an educational resource in service to its members and other practicing clinicians. While this webinar reflects the views of the panelists, it is not intended to be the only approved standard of practice or to dictate an exclusive course of treatment. Members should always use their best judgment in determining a course of action and be guided by the needs of the individual patient, available resources, and institutional or clinical practice limitations. All attendees will be muted except the presenters. Time at the end of the presentation will be reserved for questions. So please type a question in the question and answer window at any time. We will read as many selected questions as possible to the presenters during the allotted question and answer time. A recording of this webinar will be archived on the ASRM website in the coming weeks, so please watch your email for notification. We have an illustrious panel, and before I begin, let me introduce our moderator for today's session, Dr. Julia Woodward. Dr. Woodward is a clinical psychologist and associate professor in the departments of psychiatry and behavioral science and obstetrics and gynecology at Duke University Health System. She has published several papers, book chapters outlining optimal psychosocial and educational support for LGBTQ plus persons pursuing fertility treatment. Let me correct myself here. It's LGBTQ plus persons pursuing fertility treatment. She directs the patient support program at the Duke Fertility Center and provides direct clinical care for LGBTQ plus patients, including psychoeducational consultation for LGBTQ plus recipients of donor sperm, eggs, embryos, psychological counseling for LGBTQ plus patients experiencing infertility or pregnancy loss, and psychological evaluation of gamete donors. That's her. Just think about our panelists. So let me hand over the webinar to Dr. Woodward.
Thank you, Sarah. I really appreciate that lovely introduction. Just want to welcome everyone to the webinar this afternoon. We're so pleased to have you here. I think the first step in the process is that we wanted to get a little bit of a better sense of who our webinar attendees are, what our audience makeup looks like. And so Sarah is going to share with us a brief poll that gives you the opportunity to give a little bit about your background. All right, so it looks like we are a diverse group and that many folks didn't feel like any of those categories fit them very well. So just want to take a moment to introduce our first presenter, Dr. Paula Amato. Dr. Amato is a professor of obstetrics and gynecology at Oregon Health and Science University School of Medicine. She's a reproductive endocrinologist and the director of their third-party reproduction program. Dr. Amato currently serves as the vice president of ASRM. She's a former member of the board of directors of the Gay and Lesbian Medical Association and a lifelong advocate for LGBTQ plus family health. So Dr. Amato, thanks so much for your talk.
Thank you very much, Julia, and welcome everybody. I'm very pleased to be participating today. Thank you for the invitation. So for my portion of the talk, here. I'm going to be concentrating on more of the medical aspects related to family building for LGBTQ individuals before I turn it over to my co-presenters to talk more about the legal and psychosocial aspects. We'll also be reviewing the relevant FDA and ASRM guidelines related to donor gametes and talk a little bit about fertility preservation for transgender individuals. So currently there's over 100,000 same-sex couples in the United States that are raising children under 18. And as a group, LGBT adults, about 37% of them have had a child at some point in their lives, which obviously is a lot less than their heterosexual counterparts. And if you look at same-sex couples, about 24% of female same-sex couples are raising children, and about 8% of same-sex male couples are raising children. And there's definitely been a demographic shift, because if you look at those same percentages in younger people, in same-sex couples under 50, almost 50% of female same-sex couples are raising children, and about 20% of male same-sex couples. Although the majority of LGBT individuals have biologic children, they're also much more likely to adopt and foster than their heterosexual counterparts. Data on transgender individuals is a little bit harder to come by, but it's thought that between 25 and 50% of all transgender individuals are parents. And a lot of the time, these are children that they've had prior to transitioning. So what are the options for cisgender single women and female same-sex couples? So the most common option by far would be donor insemination, with or without ovarian stimulation. And the donor sperm can be what we call anonymous or non-identified, or from a known or directed donor. In some cases, the patient might undergo autologous IVF, especially if the patient has infertility. And an increasingly common option is what we call co-IVF or reciprocal IVF. This is when the eggs of one partner are fertilized with donor sperm, and then the embryo is transferred into the uterus of the other partner, so both partners can participate in the process. And of course, embryo donation is also an option, especially when egg donation is necessary. So in addition to having to decide whose eggs to use, usually a couple has to decide who will carry the pregnancy. And some of the factors that go into that decision-making include the age of the respective partners, their medical and gynecological histories, their desire to become pregnant, who has insurance and who has fertility insurance is often a factor, and the presence of existing children as well. So as I mentioned earlier, same-sex female couples or single women can use either anonymous or non-identified donor sperm or a directed donor. There are obviously pros and cons to each. Anonymous donor sperm can be more expensive. A vial now costs around $1,000 per vial, so that could quickly add up. There's obviously a lower risk of custody issues in an anonymous situation. There is the option for open ID donors, and this is a donor who agrees to reveal their identifying information to the child if the child requests it when the child turns 18. As far as using a directed donor, that can be somewhat more affordable and less expensive. That donor can develop a relationship with the child if all parties wish that and agree. In some states, that donor might actually have some rights, so be sure you're aware of the laws in your particular state, and I'm sure Robert will speak more to that. And then a very common scenario to ensure biological connection of both partners to the child is to use a relative of one of the partners, often the brother of one of the female partners. These are the guidelines for anonymous sperm donation set up by the FDA and some recommendations by the ASRM as well. And I'm sure most of the people in our audience are probably familiar with these, but just to review, an anonymous sperm donor needs to undergo a medical history and physical exam. They need to fill out a donor questionnaire. They have to have STI testing in an FDA-approved lab within 7 days of producing the sperm sample. The sperm has to be quarantined for 6 months, and then the donor has to be retested. And very importantly, the donor must meet all these eligibility requirements for that sperm to be used in an anonymous situation. The ASRM also recommends psychoeducational counseling and screening of the sperm donor, genetic screening, and STI testing of both the recipient and the recipient's sexually intimate partner or partners. For a directed donor, the requirements and recommendations are quite similar, but I'll just point out some differences. So in a directed donor situation, ineligible sperm can actually be used as long as the specimen is labeled appropriately and the recipient is counseled regarding the risks. ASRM, again, recommends that the directed donor undergo psychoeducational screening, medical history, genetic screening, STI testing of both the recipient and her partner, and also recommends that the recipient be offered quarantine of the sperm for at least 35 days with retesting. In my particular practice, we don't require this. We only require negative testing within 7 days. And then we also obviously encourage a legal consultation. And again, the laws vary by state. This was a paper published about a year ago now that looked at a series of single women, heterosexual women in heterosexual relationships using donor sperm, and then women in same-sex relationship, looking at cumulative live birth rates over the number of cycles of donor insemination. And there were no differences amongst those groups, but obviously there was differences according to age, as one would expect. It's obviously more successful for younger women and less successful for older women. In fact, you can see there's relative plateau after about 6 cycles in younger women and after about 3 cycles in older women. And this provides some guidance as to when to move on, for example, from donor insemination to something more aggressive like IVF. What are the fertility options for cisgender single men and same-sex male couples? So most commonly, they would choose to use an egg donation and a gestational carrier. And they might use sperm from one or both partners, commonly from both partners. And the egg donor can be, again, anonymous or non-identified, or known or directed. Although traditional surrogacy is still legal in some states, it is strongly discouraged. And the FDA requirements and ASRM recommendations are similar for egg donors. Physical exam within 6 months of donation, the donor questionnaire, STI testing in an FDA-approved lab within 30 days of the egg retrieval. And again, the donor must be eligible in order for those eggs to be donated anonymously. Furthermore, the ASRM recommends psychoeducational counseling, genetic screening. In our practice, we do expanded panel, carrier screening, medical history, STI testing of both the recipient and their partner, and legal consultation. And although this is not an ASRM requirement, we do it in our practice, a urine drug screen as well. For gestational carriers, ASRM recommends a history and physical exam, questionnaire, medical clearance by a qualified professional. In our practice, we send our gestational carriers to perinatologists for clearance, but no OB/GYN is also suitable. And we do the usual prenatal blood work, make sure that the gestational carrier is up to date, pap smear, mammogram according to the current guidelines, and we assess immunization status specifically for rubella, varicella, and these days for COVID as well. The gestational carrier undergoes psychoeducational screening. They undergo STI testing, a urine drug screen, some assessment of uterine cavity, usually with a saline infusion sonogram, and legal consultation. And again, the laws vary by state. As far as success rates, usually with anonymous egg donation, we quote around 70% per cycle. And obviously with a directed donor or a co-IVF situation, it's going to depend on the age of the person providing the eggs. Many of these patients these days are also undergoing pre-implantation genetic testing for aneuploid. And in those situations, success rates, again, are close to 70% irrespective of age. What about for transgender individuals? So we know that many transgender persons desire children. This is known from surveys. And most of them are of reproductive age when they transition and will have relationships afterwards. We also know that gender-affirming hormone therapy and surgery can impact fertility. And in some cases, those impacts might be reversible, such as with hormone therapy, but sometimes they could be irreversible, of course, such as is the case with gonadectomy. Both WPATH and the Endocrine Society, so WPATH is the World Professional Association of Transgender Health, recommend that all transgender individuals be counseled and be offered options for fertility preservation, ideally prior to transition. What are those options? So for transgender women or transfeminine non-binary individuals, these are persons who are assigned male at birth. Most straightforward would be sperm banking. TESI is also an option for patients who cannot ejaculate for some reason. What's trickier is what to do with prepubertal patients or transgender youth on pubertal blockers. You could theoretically freeze sperm, but this is, or freeze testicular tissue pre-puberty, but this is considered experimental at this time. For transgender men or transmasculine non-binary individuals, they can undergo egg or embryo freezing. And if they're freezing embryos using either partner or donor sperm, success rate downstream obviously going to depend on the age, the time of fertility preservation. Can also undergo ovarian tissue cryopreservation. This is no longer considered experimental, and there have been several hundred births worldwide, but all of these have involved transplantation of the tissue back, usually in cis individuals. Again, the question of what to do in prepubertal girls or youth transitioning or children on pubertal suppression is a little more challenging, and perhaps in vitro maturation in future may be an option for these patients. What are the reproductive options for transgender persons? This is actually Tristan Reese. He's a trans man that lives here in Portland. This is his husband. They adopted a couple of kids and he had a biological child as well. He's an educator and advocate for transgender parenthood. Usually this involves discontinuing their hormone therapy if they're on hormone therapy in order to undergo ovarian stimulation. Although I have heard recently that people have tried stimulation, leaving people on testosterone, for example, and have had good results. We don't do it in my particular practice just because of the sort of lack of data about the effects of testosterone exposure on the gametes. So usually for a transgender male, we'll ask them to stop the testosterone. Usually they can expect their menses to return in about 3 to 6 months, and then they can undergo ovarian stimulation with egg freezing or embryo freezing, or pregnancy for that matter, if they decide to carry the pregnancy themselves. For transgender men and trans masculine non-binary individuals, they can undergo intrauterine insemination if they wish to carry the pregnancy with partner sperm or donor sperm. They can undergo IVF using their own eggs, partner's eggs, depending on the social situation, and they can carry, or the partner can carry, or gestational carrier can carry. So kind of sort of lots of options depending on the social situation. For transgender women and transfeminine non-binary individuals, these are again persons assigned male at birth, their sperm can be used to inseminate a partner who has a uterus and eggs, or sperm can be used for IVF using partner or donor eggs, and partner can carry or gestational carrier can carry depending on the situation. Perhaps uterine transplantation may be an option in the future, but not quite yet. This is a small series from Boston IVF, actually looking at transgender men who underwent IVF, ovarian stimulation, and they looked at outcomes, both oocyte yield and live birth rate in a subset of patients, and found that the outcomes were actually comparable in the transgender patients compared to the cisgender patients. The only difference being that slightly higher dose of gonadotropins were needed in the transgender men who had been on hormone therapy. Some additional considerations: the barriers to access, of course, costs, and this is true of many infertility patients in general. A lot of these procedures are very expensive, and often insurance doesn't cover infertility services or fertility preservation. And of course, healthcare discrimination is still a thing. Gender identity and sexual orientation are not protected classes at the federal level, and in some states are not as well. So the laws vary. And there have been some high-profile lawsuits of same-sex couples denied treatment and transgender individuals denied infertility treatment. There's not a ton of data on transgender children born to transgender patients, but the data that does exist is largely reassuring. So there's no a priori reason to deny fertility services to this population. So I'll just summarize in saying that LGBTQ plus people have interest in having children like everybody else. The research to date would suggest that the kids do just fine. And it's our opinion, ASRM Ethics Committee opinion, that all programs should treat all requests for ART equally, regardless of sexual orientation or gender identity. We've included a few resources for you, and you get handouts. I think Sarah dropped it in the chat. If you're interested, I look forward to your questions at the end, and I will turn it back to Julia to introduce the next panelist. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Amato, for that really informative presentation. I just want to say, of course, that one of the groups that I know are probably represented here today are the nursing groups. So glad for all the nurses that have joined us today. And want to encourage people to continue using the chat. We're starting to see some questions come in there. You can either drop them in the chat or in the Q&A, and I'm monitoring both of those. And we'll cover those in the final portion of our webinar today. But I just want to welcome next Dr. Kim Bergman. Dr. Bergman is a licensed psychologist. She is co-owner and senior partner of Growing Generations, one of the oldest and largest surrogacy and egg donor agencies in the world. She currently serves on the executive committee of the mental health professional group of ASRM, and she is an emeritus board member of the Family Equity Council. Thanks, Dr. Bergman.
Thank you. There we go. I was just waiting for control of the slides. Okay. These are the learning objectives for today. Thank you for joining. I'm so glad that you're all here. And some of what I'm going to talk about is going to overlap with what you just heard, and some of it will overlap with what you're going to hear from Robert in a little bit, because all aspects of our practices are intertwined. So, and I have actually two handouts. They're the end of my slides, but I created them as handouts for you with the terminology that can be very helpful. Some of it you've already heard. Some of it you may know, maybe you know all of it. And then also a list of resources for you and your LGBTQ plus patients. So you'll be able to access those. You should have them already now. Okay, so when do LGBTQ plus patients face their biggest challenges? Before they embark on family building, during their family building journey, or after their family is formed? Well, it's all of the above. There are issues to be dealt with during every aspect of family building for the LGBTQ plus client. So before the journey, parenthood begins with a wish. And once that wish takes root, it is really compelling. It's consuming, and it is something that is hard to turn your mind from. But for LGBTQ plus intended parents, the journey is complex. There are a lot of issues medically. There are issues psychologically. There are issues legally, socially, emotionally, logistically that have to be dealt with. So issues for all potential parents, including LGBTQ. Will I be a good parent? Can I afford to raise children? Is this a world I want to bring children into? How will having children change my life? How will it restructure things? These are things that all potential parents are thinking about in terms of the psychosocial, emotional aspect of parenting. For people who are going to use ART, there's a whole nother level. Biological connection to the child, conceiving with a third party, involving a lot of extra people, extra science, societal and familial attitudes about ART, having to come out as using IVF, or dealing with feelings of failure of my body, educating your family, educating your friends, and eventual disclosure to child and family. So for the LGBTQ potential parent, they have all of the issues we just talked about, all the same things that every parent is thinking about, all the same things that any parent going through third party is thinking about. But additionally, things that have come to mind, identity issues. There's definitely an identity shift when someone comes out. They tamp down their wish to be a parent. They may think they can't be a parent. Maybe they don't know that there will be ways, and it's something that they feel like they have to give up. And then maybe at some point later in their coming out process, they come back to the realization that they really want this, and then they research it. And as Paula mentioned, this is actually something we see really changing, because younger and younger LGBTQ plus people are assuming they're going to follow a so-called traditional trajectory of finding their spouse, getting married, and having children. In my generation, we waited much longer because we didn't know we had the same level of access. So that's something that's changing. Internalized homophobia, impossible to avoid. We are all raised in a heteronormative society. So am I doing my child a disservice by not having them have a dad, or having them have a mom, or having them have gay parents? These are thoughts going through one's head. And then actual societal homophobia, quite a bit of discrimination toward LGBTQ parents in every aspect of parenthood, from infancy on through school. Access to care, access to culturally competent care, and navigating the legal issues that you're going to hear about in a little while. For some psychosocial challenges, additionally, psychological versus biological parenting. So with a same-sex couple, there's always going to be one parent that has a biological connection, one parent that doesn't. So there are some potential issues that can come up between the couple or individually. And it is on the parents to establish themselves as the legitimate parents. But it is, something that certainly is can be a minefield. When I gave birth to our first daughter, and my wife gave birth to our second daughter, and when our second daughter was born, my mother-in-law said, "Now you each have one." To which we had to do a lot of educating and consciousness raising, and 25 years later, we're still doing it. So getting validation from family and friends and the greater community, and talking to others about your family structure. Coming out is a lifelong process, and coming out as an LGBTQ parent is a lifelong process. So for transgender intended parents, there's all of the things you've already heard that I just mentioned, and additionally, facing multiple barriers to reproductive care and treatment. Some of the things that Paula just talked about. There's so much still to learn about this population in most practices. Fertility preservation is expensive. Not all practices offer it. Not all people understand that they can have it. One of the saddest things for me is when I encounter a client who wants to be a parent, and they now need a donor for a part that they actually had, but they didn't know that they could use at the time that they transitioned and maybe had surgery or went on vacation. Medical staff are often insensitive and uneducated about transgender issues, terminology. When I give this talk in practices, the number one question I get is, how do I know what to call people? What are the terms? Just a general lack of understanding of non-binary gender issues in care. Paula mentioned this, so I won't belabor it, but a lot of transgender people want to have children, just like a lot of LGBTQ plus people want to have children. And transgender men with children score better on mental health scales. Transgender women with children have lower suicide risk. And there's no evidence that transgender parenting has any kind of adverse results long-term for the children that result. Transgender youth, like LGBTQ youth, are coming to the desire for biological parenting much younger than decades ago, and they want answers and they want practices that will help them and will understand what the best path for them. Again, Paula went over this data, so I'm going to move on. So choices. For LGBTQ parents, there's always extra people involved. How will we become parents? Who will carry the child? Which partner goes first? Whose sperm to use? Whose egg to use? Using a known or an agency donor, fertility preservation and planning, all of the medical aspects that Paula just went over. Now, from the psychological perspective, there's a lot of issues to think through. Sometimes it's really obvious in a couple who goes first because one partner's always had a desire to be a parent and a biological parent, the other hasn't. But sometimes it's not so obvious. Sometimes both parents really want to have a biological connection. And it is important to talk through with an expert the feelings of potentially being left behind when you're not the biological parent. There's a lot of educating that helps with some of these psychosocial issues. On the legal side, you'll hear more details in the next presentation, but there's always extra steps we have to take. My wife and I, because of the age of our kids now, they were born over 25 years ago, we had to each do a second parent adoption for each other's biological child. It was thousands of dollars. It took about 2 years for each of us to become the legal parent of the other child. It was painful. At the time, the social worker had to recommend against, and then our lawyer had to go to a judge to overturn. It was really a treacherous situation. So there are definitely lots of legal hoops at the beginning, but they don't end actually even after. We were stopped at an airport once and not allowed to leave the country because we didn't have a note from our children's father. We had their birth certificates, but we had to get lawyers involved to allow us to get on a plane. This is stuff we deal with all the time, and this is being an LGBTQ parent. It's expensive and it takes a lot of time, and there's a lot of extra protections we have to put in place. Just a little levity. We have 1 or 2 reservations about your application to adopt. Oh, here we go. It's the gay thing, isn't it? Just, you know, it is always there. Okay, so medical barriers for LGBTQ plus intended parents. Clinic staff, not well trained. Many clinics are well trained, but some aren't. And, you know, some of it's dictated by region, some of it's not. There can be a lack of overall cultural competency in the staff, and that can be in all the staff. So you can have a really well-informed doctor and even a nursing team, but if the front desk person doesn't understand that the couple before them are equal parents in the room, that could present a problem. Medical forms not being inclusive or representative. You know, when you have to fill out a form and the first thing you have to do is cross off husband, wife, or cross off mother, father, that is not a welcoming way to start at a practice. Some practices continue to discriminate against LGBTQ and in particular transgender parents. Some don't know how to serve that population, but some actively discriminate against. Understanding and really acknowledging that the couple is the patient. It is very common in LGBT same-sex couples will tell me that their IVF doctor or their OB only speaks to the pregnant person and never includes the non-pregnant spouse. It's really, really important. And then assuming that gender is binary, big problem because we know that it isn't. So how do you make your practice LGBTQ inclusive? You create some best practices. You take webinars like this, you bring in consultants, you train all the staff to be culturally competent. So you do an in-service with everybody from the front desk to the back to the lab, so everybody understands what the patient's needs are. Update and make sure all your forms are inclusive and gender non-binary. It's very small detail that goes a long way to welcoming patients in. And check your website, check your forms, check your bathroom signs. It's really important. Understand and take your LGBTQ patient concerns seriously. In this category are things like, I often hear from lesbians that want to go to an REI that, they're told they don't have fertility issues because they've never not been able to get pregnant. Well, they've also never tried. So really taking patients' concerns seriously and thinking through the whole picture of who they are. And again, treating both members of an LGBTQ couple as equal members of the patient team, same way you would treat a heterosexual couple. So who are the parents? This is important because like my mother-in-law and like this previous comment about the couple, the parents are the individuals who love and literally parent the child. With ART or with adoption, contributing the egg, the sperm, the womb, having a biological connection to the child does not automatically make that person the parent. The individuals contributing these ingredients might be the parents, but they also might not. So it's really important to think about language, both with your patients and to help your patients understand what the use of language with their family, friends, and eventually with their kids. So as Paula said, research on LGBTQ parents overwhelmingly shows that children and adolescents raised by LGBTQ parents function as well as those raised by any parents in terms of mental health outcomes and peer relations. And there is a really deep well of research here. Most important takeaway, and I had to chuckle, it's pretty much the same takeaway in Paula's last slide. LGBTQ plus patients need the same level of cultural competency that we should bring to all of our diverse patients. They want to be treated fairly with sensitivity, and they want to be successful in creating their families. So I've got some resources. I'm going to go through these slides real quick for you just to get to the end so that Robert's lined up. But I have these on handouts for you, and here are the slides with terminology. So you'll have both these, the terminology and the resources as PDFs. And thank you so much. I look forward to your questions at the end of the final panel.
Thank you, Dr. Bergman. That was so interesting and informative. We are getting some really good questions coming in on the chat, so I'm excited to get to that momentarily. But first, I'm really excited for you guys to be able to hear from Robert Terenzio. Mr. Terenzio has been practicing, he's been a practicing attorney for 25 years, and he's practiced exclusively in the ART law space for the past 21 years. So he regularly works with LGBTQ plus clients who are pursuing gestational surrogacy, gay meat recipiency, second parent or step parent adoptions, cross-parentage petitions, and secondary donations. So thanks so much, Robert.
Thank you for allowing me to participate. I'm wondering if my video is up. I can't see.
It is.
Perfect. Yes, and Kim, thank you for going over your journey with the second parent adoptions that you and your wife had to go through. I find that when I look back at my career, I'm just as clueless today as I was 21 or 22 years ago, and the reason is different. There certainly is more, there certainly are more cases available for me to look at, but the questions that are coming are so much more complex than they were back then. What you went through with your wife is what I deal with quite often. Thankfully, because this is a collaborative space, I'm dealing with doctors and other lawyers and social workers prior to the patients being put through their family building medical cycles, which makes it easier as opposed to what I'm generally doing, which is fixing problems. That started well before I was ever involved. So I would like to present some of the things that occur in the course of my day. The learning objectives here are what we would want to learn. We want to better serve our LGBTQIA clients. We want to give them what they want at the end of the day, which is their parental order and their names on the birth certificate. There's a case that was just filed within the last couple of weeks. We're going to get to that at the end of my presentation. Because this case is so unique, I thought to limit my presentation today to something that I deal with a lot, and that's the marital presumption of parentage. Now, as the definition says on the screen, the husband's presumed to be the legal father of a child born to or conceived by his wife. So if we're looking in an Arkansas code section, the mother is deemed to be the woman who gives birth. It doesn't require a lot of imagination to figure that out. But it goes on to say that if the mother was married at the time of the conception or the delivery, her husband shall be entered on the birth certificate as the father of the child. It's interesting that it's written this way, by the way, because it doesn't speak to where the sperm came from. It just speaks to who's going to be designated the father. And we'll get back to that in a moment. Texas handles it a little bit differently. Again, mother-child relationship established by the delivery. But here, Texas changed its perspective of the father. The father is able to identify himself by issuing a voluntary acknowledgement of paternity, or if he's held that child out as his own and resided in the home with that child for the previous 2 years, he will also be designated as the father. Interesting that we're even further afield now from having a genetic connection to the child. And how did we get to that particular space? Well, let's look at the history here. In the old world, succession was always winning out over women's rights. The feudalistic society was looking towards the men being able to maintain their space in the hierarchy of their world, be it the UK or Britain or France. When the New World was established, it changed a little bit. The New World, the United States and Canada, did not necessarily look to, for all of the obvious reasons anyways, to maintain any birthrights, but they did want to not have to deal with financial responsibility for children. So marriage then trumped that genetic connection. As we evolved as a society and as our democracy evolved, we saw a bigger split between what was happening on the state level and what was happening in the federal level. And the state level is tasked, as I'm sure you all know, with generating the birth certificates. But a lot of the law that designates who the parents are is federal. So there is a trickle-down effect that has to occur in order for the states to issue those birth certificates. The 60s, of which I have to admit I was part of to a certain extent, demonstrate a desire for unmarried fathers to take control and to be financially responsible for their children. I don't think that that's any stretch of the imagination. People were thinking a little out of the ordinary in the 60s. People were looking more at societal's view of parentage and how to best take care of the children that were being born. As we shift into the 90s, genetic testing is available, and we see again a rift occurring in how parentage is supposed to occur. The presumption caused through marriage could conceal a biological connection. And that was addressed in 2002 by the Uniform Parentage Act, which said that the mother of the child and a man claiming to be the genetic father may sign an acknowledgement of paternity with intent to establish that man's paternity. So the presumption that the married person, the married man, is in fact the father of the child born to his wife is rebutted by the way that this Parentage Act is laid out. Now, certainly maternity is found to be unrebuttable. Even through genetic testing, that's no surprise. At that time, gestational surrogacy was not available. In the 80s and 90s, sperm donation becomes more mainstream, but marriage was not available to the gay and lesbian community. And without marriage, there's no presumption. So the birth mother remains the only mother and the only parent, and her partner is viewed as a legal stranger to that child. And the legal stranger means that she would have no rights to custody or control. We move now to the 2000s, ovum donation, gestational surrogacy. We now have everybody having access to parenting, lesbian or gay couples, singles, and the intended parent doesn't necessarily have to also be a birth mother. And I'm going to sit here for a moment on 2015, the Supreme Court. The case that I'm referring to here is the Obergefell case. And as I'm sure you all know, that addressed the prohibition against same-sex marriage. And the US Supreme Court said that same-sex marriages have to be granted and states must recognize sister state same-sex marriages. What's interesting is the language that the court used, and I'll quote a couple of lines. No union is more profound than marriage, for it embodies the highest levels of love, fidelity, devotion, sacrifice, and family. The court goes on to say the right to marry safeguards children and families and thus draws meanings from the related rights of child rearing, procreation, and education. By virtue of their exclusion from this institution, that being marriage, same-sex couples are denied the constellation of benefits that states have linked to marriage. So we have then a scenario where if you are a same-sex couple, you have a right to get married, and presumably you would have a right to have both of your names listed on a birth certificate. But as I mentioned before, what's happening on the federal level is not necessarily occurring on the state level. Vital records will operate under state law, and if the state laws do not match what's happening on the federal side, they're going to ignore it unless someone forces them to. And here we are, we have Pavin versus Smith, a lawsuit where two married lesbian couples relied on anonymous sperm donation to have children. Now, they did fill out certificates of live birth. They did list their respective spouses as parents. And Arkansas issued birth certificates bearing only the birth mother's names. Arkansas argued that being named on the birth certificate is not a benefit that accompanies marriage. What's fascinating to me when I look at this case is not necessarily the Supreme Court's view, oh, that's certainly powerful. It's what occurred in the trial court and in the appellate court level. The trial court, interestingly enough, found for the two couples. They said that the two couples were correct and that the two couples had a right to their certificates listing both of them as parents. The state, of course, appealed, and that appeal eventually found its way to the Arkansas Supreme Court. The Arkansas Supreme Court is an interesting read because they decided to look at the case incredibly narrowly. They said that there is no way that the Obergefell case talks about vital records. It doesn't talk about birth certificates, and therefore these women should not receive a birth certificate listing all of them as parents. What I like in the opinion, and if you look it up, it's fascinating. One of the justices, the only dissenting justices, called out everybody else. And he said, wait a minute here, the US Supreme Court said that marriage protections for children and families are material. Marriage confers profound benefits, including recognition and legal structure for a relationship that allows children to understand the integrity and closeness of their own family and its concord with the families in their community. They were called out. No way about it. And when the US Supreme Court took the case, they called out the Arkansas Supreme Court again. And so the Pavin Court specifically says that same-sex couples do have a right to the constellation benefits that the states have linked to traditional marriage. And they pointed out that Arkansas would list a husband on a birth certificate even when the couple relied upon a sperm donor. Now, isn't that interesting? If that's available to traditional couples, it falls within the constellation benefits afforded to traditional couples, and it must then be provided to a same-sex couple. So here's the case that prompted me to go down this path: Porterfield versus Nebraska. Porterfield, this is an unmarried lesbian couple. They each inseminated with the same sperm donor, They followed voluntary acknowledgments of parentage, VAPs, and Nebraska rejected them. Now, in '92, as the slide points out, the legislature enacted paternity laws to ensure the parents were providing support to the children. And Nebraska goes so far as to make the father of a child born out of wedlock liable for support in education in the same manner as a father born of a marriage is liable for that support. Why then are we having to deal with this issue with an unmarried lesbian couple? So Code Section 43-104-02 identify the biological father. When the child is claimed to be born out of a wedlock, there should be an attempt to inform him. And interestingly, the way the language lays, persons claiming to be the father shall file notice of his intent to claim paternity and obtain custody with the biological father registry. Well, there's no definition of what person claiming to be the father of the child is. That could be anybody. That doesn't necessarily have to be a sperm donor. So as I'm looking at this, there can be a disconnect between the biological father and the person who would like to be listed as the legal father. Going further, the biological mother, of course, is going to file a certificate of live birth. She shall complete and file the affidavit in writing and under oath. And as we can see, this is what it looks like. She's going to list her name. She's going to talk about some of the particularities of the delivery, where it occurred. And it's going to say, and I look to 5A, I know and am identifying the biological father or possible biological fathers as follows. So again, there's no delineation that this person called the biological father is in fact the biological father. There may or may not be a connection. Now, why is that important to us here in Porterfield? Well, the child born to a married couple is presumed legitimate. Now, Pavin talks about affirming the presumption regardless of whether it's a same-sex or opposite-sex married couple. Nebraska permits the state, the mother, or the putative father to bring an action for paternity. So the mothers here have standing to bring this case. And the evidentiary law, the evidentiary code in Nebraska will permit a default judgment against a putative father if he doesn't appear. What does that mean? Well, that means that we don't need any evidence that this supposed father is in fact the biological father. So the court can determine paternity without evidence, and a father whose paternity is established by a final voluntary acknowledgement has the same right to seek custody as the child's biological mother, even if subsequent genetic testing shows no biological relationship. Remember the Texas statute that talked about holding a child out as one's own for 2+ years. This is Nebraska's version of that very same thing. So this couple is saying to Nebraska, we don't have to present any evidence about a connection to a father. Now, of course, they used donor sperm, but that's anonymous. And if we don't have to present that, then we should be viewed similarly to a married couple and permit the names, our names, to be put on the birth certificate without more. Now, this is typical stuff here that I deal with. These ladies are stuck in a course of litigation. They're going to spend thousands and thousands of dollars. It's probably going to go to the US Supreme Court. And it's because there is not a gender-neutral marital presumption available to them. You could see the number of states that don't have gender-neutral marital presumptions. Overwhelming compared to the states that do. In a gender-neutral marital presumption state, these ladies would not have to go through this process. They would, in fact, obtain their birth certificate. And I point to a law that was just put into effect, Connecticut Public Act. Parents who sign a voluntary acknowledgement of parentage shall fully satisfy the requirements of the presumption, and no further evidence shall be required. Simple. But we're stuck, and they're stuck, and a lot of people are stuck. And planning before the IUI, before the surrogacy, before the donation will make things a heck of a lot easier for everybody. And I hope that in the context of what I presented, as narrow as issue as it was, we can see some of this. And thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Terenzio. Really appreciate that really detailed context, and the historical perspective I think is so important as well. So we are at the 5 o'clock hour, and I know that many of you are not going to be able to stay much longer, but we as the presenters did want to spend a couple of extra minutes, maybe the next 3 to 5 minutes, just answering some of the questions that came up in the chat. Really appreciate the active discussion that was happening there. Also want to give recognition to all the genetics counselors that are also part of the other group from the beginning of the day. So one of the questions that was raised in the Q&A that I wanted to mention to folks was this question about, are there any templates or guidance that could be used for improving the medical forms and the intake forms that are in practices? Is that anything the panelists have experience with?
I don't have a template for you, but all you need to do is ungender your terms. So on the terminology sheet that I sent you, that's one of the handouts, there's lots of alternatives, but a really easy way is just to really just ungender. So anywhere that you have mother, just put parent, or father is parent. After, on your form where you probably have a box that says gender and you have male, female, you could just leave it open-ended. That I feel like is better than having a list of 10 different options, male, female, non-binary. Nobody wants to label themselves and box themselves, but if you just put gender, what's your gender identification, then let your patients be the guide. So you don't need to change your forms. You don't need to rework your forms, just ungender them. And, that it's not that, it's pretty straightforward.
Thank you. There's another question that's come up a little bit here and also on some of the REI listservs, asking about whether or not LGBTQ plus patients who are using donor gametes to build their families should be required to have a psychological consultation, or is that a discriminatory practice? So just wanted to see what the panelists might have to say.
I'll take that one too, since you're talking about the psych end. Yes, they should be required to. Just like all heterosexual couples and single people. Anybody who's using third party, who's using donor gametes or somebody to carry their baby, should have a psychoeducational consult. And it's an educational consult. There are a lot of things that people don't know they don't know. They haven't thought about the issue of being the non-biological parent. This is the same for fertility patients, whether they're heterosexual or they're same sex, doesn't matter. There are issues that come up, and I think it's really important to clarify for our LGBTQI plus clients that we're not singling them out because of that. We're having this psychoeducational consult because we're experts in this field, and we know that there are things that can come up that they probably haven't thought about yet. And we have a sort of a list of things we talk about, and my consult with a gay couple or a heterosexual couple is almost exactly the same. So yes, but that goes for everybody.
I just second that. I think that's exactly how we do it here as well. And I think it's a really important kind of education that everybody deserves, regardless of their background. Okay. There's another question here that this is somebody, Amanda, has tried a couple different ways. I think her question has to do with if you have a same-sex male couple, a gay couple, and they are both wanting to contribute sperm to fertilize donor eggs and do an IVF cycle. And I think the question is, Dr. Amato already replied that, that you could split the eggs and use some sperm from each partner to fertilize. But I think the question may be then what, in terms of whether multiple embryos are transferred. Amanda, feel free to type if I'm misunderstanding your question. But how do folks approach these kinds of same-sex male couples going through IVF?
Yeah, I'll take that. That's a good question. I mean, we tend to follow ASRM guidelines regarding embryo transfer, and we highly encourage single embryo transfer. I know often there's desire to transfer one embryo from each partner. We have done that occasionally, but especially, with young anonymous egg donors or PGT-A tested embryos, we strongly encourage single embryo transfer.
And this is where, and this is where the psychologist or the mental health professional can be helpful, because a lot of times the reason that people want to do the 2 embryos, one from each, is because they both want to be the dad. And so that's where we can come in with the education of, you will both be the dads, no matter what. It's not that genetics aren't important. Obviously, the genetics are important, but in terms of what makes a family, that is not limited to genetics. And, so we do a lot of counseling in that regard to help them. And we usually advise, of course, that they do one at a time. And often they do one at a time. They'll do exactly as Paula said. They'll do one batch, they'll split the eggs, they'll have them frozen, and they'll use ones for the first baby and the other ones for the second baby.
Okay. Well, just to respect people's time, we have certainly not gotten through all of the questions. But I think in the interest of time, and also appreciating that some of our panelists actually have some commitments following this as well, I just want to say thank you to everyone for your involvement and for sharing your expertise with this group. It's been an excellent webinar.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks.